Hello everyone, welcome to a new lecture in the series of data-driven model predictive control. So far in this lecture series, we were focusing on model-based data-driven MPC schemes, where the system identification is also a part of the algorithm. In this lecture, we will discuss model-free control approaches, where the control input is directly computed from the data without a system identification step.
Here is the overview. We start with a brief introduction to model-free data-driven MPC. Then we move on to one of the approaches in this category, which is called data-enabled predictive control. As the name implies, model-free data-driven MPC does not use a model for computing the control input. Instead, it will directly use the data. Here, the data is directly used for computing the control schemes, and the MPC does not need an explicit system model for computing the control input. And these model-free approaches are useful when the traditional system modeling is impractical or infeasible, or in other cases where the model is not accurately representing the system, or the model changes over time, etc. Here we listed two examples for model-free control approaches. First one is called data-enabled predictive control, or DeePC, which is a recently introduced approach, and it uses database equality constraints in MPC. In MPC, we commonly use a model-based equality constraint, which is defined by the state equation for the system. Here, we will be replacing that model-based equality constraint with a data-based constraint. And the second one is the reinforcement learning, or RL, which is a popular approach in machine learning. And it is a data-driven decision-making approach which learns control policies, normally in online, using the data. And in the rest of the lecture, we will discuss the concept of DeePC in more detail. Data-enabled predictive control, or DeePC, is a recently introduced approach in the category of model-free control. And in DeePC, the equality constraints are defined using the training data itself without going into an identification step. In SPC, we have derived a Hankel matrix-based output prediction equation which predict the future output matrix capital YF as a function of the past input matrix UP, past output matrix YP, and future input matrix UF. Similar to the lecture in SPC, we define the past and future input and output sequences as in equation number 2, which are special cases of these block Hankel matrices with only one column. Then in SPC, this equation is solved for finding the parameters P1, P2, and By, which is used to define the model-based constraints. When it comes to DeePC, this parameter identification step, where we identify this parameter matrix capital P, which contains this P1, P2, and By, is excluded. And the equality constraints in the MPC part is defined using the Hankel matrix itself. This is achieved by using the fundamental lemma, also known as the Williams fundamental lemma. The fundamental lemma says that if we have an input training data sequence which is sufficiently rich or which satisfies the persistency of excitation condition, then for every trajectory which consists of the future output and control sequence of the system, there is a solution vector Vk which satisfies equation 3. So in other words, every trajectory of the system should satisfy this condition. This can be considered as a data-driven equality constraint, which can be used instead of the model-based constraint. We can say that the fundamental lemma gives a relationship between the future output and input to the past data in the system, which is represented using these Hankel matrices. And since these Hankel matrices capture the dynamics of the system, we can say that this is equivalent to a model. Then in the case of MPC, the cost function will be defined using the predicted output and control input UK. And for defining the constraint, we will be using this equation. Now in DeePC, the fundamental lemma is used to construct the equality constraint in the MPC. In other words, the optimal control sequence and the corresponding predicted output sequence should satisfy fundamental lemma equation. Here we will be using the input and output reference values, which are denoted by UR and YR, which will be used to define the cost function for MPC. This leads to the optimization problem for DeePC as in equation number 4, where the control sequence UK and the solution vector to the fundamental lemma equation, which is the vector VK, becomes the decision variables. Here, the cost function JK will be a quadratic sum of the predicted output error and control error as in other output-based LMTC algorithms. A regularization term containing the norm of the vector Vk is also included in the cost function to avoid trivial solutions. And this optimization problem is solved at each time instant to obtain the optimal control sequence UK star, and the first element of the sequence is applied to the system. Note that in both the subspace predictive control and DeePC, the state vector does not come into the picture directly. Consequently, both SPC and DeePC are normally implemented in an output-based MPC framework. And this optimization problem can be implemented in MATLAB and solved using solvers such as fmincon. The algorithm for DeePC is summarized here. We will be requiring the input and output data or the training data, using which we will construct the Hankel matrices UP, YP, UF, and YF. Unlike in the case of SPC, we will not be using these Hankel matrices for computing the parameter matrix P, which contain P1, P2, and By. Instead, we will directly use these Hankel matrices and also the input and output data sequences YP1 and UP1 to solve the DeePC optimization problem, which computes the optimal control sequence UK star. Then the first element of the control input sequence is applied to the system, and we will repeat this until the end of the simulation time. Next, we move on to a numerical example to illustrate DeePC. Here, we are considering the same example discussed in the SPC lecture, where the system parameters are chosen as in equation 5, and the simulation parameters are chosen in this equation 6. Here, the only difference is that we have selected this capital H as 200, and also we have an additional parameter alpha, which is chosen as 1. Figure 1 shows the response with DeePC, where the figure A shows the input data and output data that are used for constructing the Hankel matrices. And the output response with the DeePC is shown in figure B, where we can see the reference output in green color and the output with the DeePC in red color, where we can see that the output is tracking the reference. And the control input with the DeePC is shown in figure C. The MATLAB codes for this numerical example can be downloaded from the link given in the description. That leads us to the end of this lecture. Thanks for watching.